I think that the attempt to sort of inoculate ourselves against the problems of liberalism from the beginning, which is constructed basically on a corrupt view of freedom. But liberalism is constructed on this view that freedom, as an Augustinian, you'll permit me a theological point, a basically Pelagian idea. Pelagius teaches that the root of freedom is choice. Our freedom to choose good or evil. That is the real freedom Pelagius teaches. And Augustine says no to Pelagius. Our only real freedom is the freedom to do the good.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Johnny and Marlo.
Today, we're recording from ISI's annual honors conference this year in Philadelphia. And Chad Pecknold, professor at Catholic University of America, is joining us today ahead of his lecture to our honor students later this week. Thanks for joining us, Chad.
Oh, my pleasure. It's really a joy to be with you all and be with these great students.
Before we get to our interview, we'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. Our mission at ISI is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in pursuing that mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Chad, you're one of the key figures in post-liberalism, and I'm wondering, we want to discuss in one of your essays in particular that you've written, but perhaps you could share with our listeners and students what is post-liberalism and what are some of the aims of the post-liberal order?
Yeah. My colleagues and I have a Substack publication called the Post-Liberal Order, and so that associates us strongly with the term. I think that on one level, the term is just descriptive, that Patrick Deneen's book, Why Liberalism Failed, is a kind of landmark watershed moment in which we recognize, and indeed even liberals like Barack Obama recognize, that in some sense it's correct, that what we conceived of as a liberal order has failed, and we're living in a post-liberal moment in which the left is no longer committed to the principles of liberalism. And in certain respects, the right has sacrificed itself on the altar of freedom in such a way that it makes it look like liberalism doesn't really have a future as such, that liberalism is something which describes the past. And so when we use the word post-liberal, in many ways, we're simply dealing with trauma. We're dealing with the sense of the loss of an ordering that is really only a couple hundred years old. And we're trying to find a way forward in the ruins of that. I think the positive side is, how do you have a constructive vision of politics in the wake of the collapse of liberalism? Now, some people, conservatives especially, I think, look to the past and say, well, maybe we can have a conservative recovery of liberalism. We can return to the classical sources of liberal thought, and maybe we can go to the particularly Whiggish side with Edmund Burke, with Russell Kirk, with Alexis de Tocqueville, and we can kind of build the pieces of liberalism back together. The trouble with that vision, and I think post-liberals like myself and Patrick Deneen, who are speaking here this week, is that that's actually part of the problem that brought us to this moment. And so it's a little bit like, going back to the well that poisoned you. Why would you go back to the well that poisoned you? And so the challenge, I think, constructively, is the constructive challenge. How do you, in a sense, build a new conservative vision that takes advantage of certain populist discomfort and even impatience with how things proceeded for liberal conservatives for years, and build something that's better, that's more constructive, that's smarter, that is going to be better for families, for individuals, for government. And I think that's the post-liberal vision on the constructive side is actually not post-liberal, but trying to look beyond the liberal for an order which is just and good, which is peaceful, and which helps people to flourish. And I think maybe in some sense, post-liberal doesn't even describe that. It's just post-liberal is almost entirely negative.
Yeah.
You mentioned this kind of popular discontent and frustration, and obviously there are other movements that perhaps have some parallels with post-liberalism, such as you might call it the New Right or national conservatism. Could you, classify would you classify post-liberalism more closely with the conservative disposition? Although there seem to be cross-spectrum alignments that can be made there, are there similarities between these different movements? What ultimately distinguishes post-liberalism from the other camps that have kind of been establishing themselves over the years?
Yeah, I think that's the ambiguity there is appreciated, because I think we're living in a moment in which there's, I think, an attempt for conservatives to return to what's familiar. And so part of it is, I think there is in some circles, there's an attempt to take advantage of the conservative democratic sentiment, which moved for Trump, for example, is an opportunity, right? An opportunity to build a new conservative vision. And for some post-liberals, if you want to use the term broadly, that means trying to take some of those themes around the common good, around a sort of working class conservatism, and make it fit for the old fusion, for the old sort of William F. Buckley fusionism. And this is what I call the fusionism 2.0 problem, trying to go back to the well, but use some of the new terms of the populist shift. And I think my colleagues at Post-Liberal Order are critical of that. We're critical of any attempt to return to what we call right liberalism. The major question, which I think ISI is dealing with and other leaders are dealing with, is, okay, but how do we deal with the institutions that we have?
Yeah.
How do we deal with the real world institutions that have legacy, that have history, that have structures that we can't just dissolve? And this leads to a lot of, I think, complexity in how the major legacy conservative institutions proceed. Do they proceed purely along fusionism 2.0 lines, just get the band back together, the band that really put us in this spot, or isn't it do we have genuine attempts to sort of see in our political moment, the post-Trumpian moment is one in which we have to say, okay, can we have a genuinely new political vision that is good? And I think that's where we are, at least my perception of what's going on at ISI is trying to discern that. How can you be a legacy institution founded in 1953 with individualism in your title, but not actually be individualist? And I think that's a challenge for all of our legacy conservative institutions. I know Kevin Roberts is dealing with that, and I know that there are criticisms of that, but we're in a complex time of trying to sort out who belongs in what camp.
Chad, one quick comment on ISI, and then I'm curious about the going back to the well and whether or not the situation we're in is inevitable, if there are ways that we can remedy that. One interesting thing that I did find on an ISI pamphlet from about 1955, which said Intercollegiate Society of Individualists. Interestingly enough, the first objective of ISI that was listed on the pamphlet said this: to further the belief that Judeo-Christian morals apply in political action as well as in individual activity.
Isn't that interesting?
So I was very intrigued to see that. So even back in the early days, there was, certainly traditionalists who wanted a more assertive, not just private moralities for the private sphere, but for the public sphere as well. So I found that to be interesting. But I guess going back to the question of going back to the well, and this connects to Patrick's book, Why Liberalism Failed. To what extent do you see as Americans the transition from classical liberalism to progressive liberalism as being just an inevitable kind of decline, right? And then second, I know Patrick often talks about the conservative tradition in America, which is neglected or looked over, and that perhaps we could have a different politics if we recovered that conservative tradition. Do you think that, I'd be curious if Tocqueville, for example, is not it, do you think there's enough of a kind of a substantive American conservative tradition that we could recover, a good, a just order without just going back to the well? Is there an alternative canon that you would propose, or is it just the function of being an American?
I mean, in a sense, your question is, does America only have one well?
Sure.
Is the only well for America the Lockean side of the founder's vision?
Yeah.
I think the answer to that is no. And Patrick's points about a conservative tradition in America are well taken. You can go back not just to John Winthrop, but, I mean, conservatives have to show a little bit of intellectual curiosity about the names of our cities, for example. We have our cities are called Sacramento, San Francisco after St. Francis, Los Angeles after the Feast of the Holy Angels, a holy king, St. Louis, St. Augustine, Florida. The fact is that things aren't inevitable. Nothing about America is inevitable. And that, I mean, if you would have asked me as a teenager if America would one day fly thousands of pride flags and everyone would be in lockstep obeisance to them, I would have said you were crazy. That's somehow contrary to the American way, where we pay allegiance to the flag. I mean, if anything should be evident about Obergefell and the sort of triumph of the pride flag over our regime, it's that anything is possible.
Yeah.
And it could easily be, a flag of the Sacred Heart, as it could be a pride flag. So I think there is nothing inevitable about the sort of liberal devolution in that sense. I think there is a way in which I dissent from the typical Straussian lines that the real problem is not liberalism, but the sort of Hegelian influence of progressivism, which comes in the 19th century, a certain tendency towards Hegelian idealism or German idealism that infects the liberal project. I think that's wrong. So in that sense, I think that the attempt to sort of inoculate ourselves against the problems of liberalism from the beginning, which is constructed basically on a corrupt view of freedom. That liberalism is constructed on this view that freedom, as an Augustinian, you'll permit me a theological point, a basically Pelagian idea. Pelagius teaches that the root of freedom is choice. Our freedom to choose good or evil. That is the real freedom Pelagius teaches. And Augustine says no to Pelagius. Our only real freedom is the freedom to do the good. And that what is the choice for evil but bondage, slavery, right? Demeaning ourselves, right? That is not true liberty.
Yeah.
And I think, there was an attempt in America, in the American conservative tradition, to think about ordered liberty as a version of that, an attempt to kind of correct a liberal conception of freedom. But look how easily conservatives lock right back into a liberal view of liberty when it comes to economics. So I think we have to challenge as conservatives that conception of liberty. There's a wonderful essay by a hero of mine, one of the founders of Christendom College, named William Marshner, who wrote this essay on liberty and social order. And he rightly says that this is at the root of our problems. He was a great critic of National Review. He always had in his sights National Review as promoting this liberal conception of freedom, which is fundamentally corrosive of authority, of tradition, of the national good. And I think in a sense, his time was too early, but not too late.
Yeah.
A phrase a friend uses from Mark Santorum, for Senator Santorum, who I think, his kind of common good conservatism and William Marshner's, critique of the concept of liberty that's corrupt. These are wells. These are sources which we can return to and think about. America could have a better future if it had a different conception of liberty.
So that kind of reminds me of, especially one of your fields of expertise is Augustine. And I believe it's the piece that you recommended or that you assigned our honor students on the religious nature of the city. I'm curious what some of the parallels between, and this is mentioned in the piece, the parallels between the Rome of Augustine's day and contemporary America, just going off what you said earlier about the pride flag kind of becoming this national symbol. And you write of how, the Romans, they prioritized consent. So their moral code was rooted in consent, and they had this tunnel vision directed toward material prosperity, totally untethered from duties to others. So kind of this hedonism that seeped into the culture. With these comparisons in mind between Rome and perhaps contemporary America, what do you think it means to live in what you called a late liberal empire?
I mean, the analogies are obvious, right? I mean, when you think about Augustine's Critique in Book 2 of Roman hedonism, and in which he has in the back of his mind St. Paul's, words on Romans, that their God is their stomach. It's hard to say that our God is not our stomach. Our appetites drive us as America. Our sexual appetites, our identity appetite, and our literal appetite for food, and yet our inability to produce anything. Our inability to actually be makers, to actually be constructors. I mean, it's not accidental, I think, that we have a crisis of fatherlessness in America, that something, our men are not able to produce children and care for them. And all we can do is celebrate choice. And I think that's what Augustine's identifying in the sort of collapse of Roman order. And I think these are more correlational than causal, that as the collapse of an order occurs, there's a kind of fight or flight attitude that many people experience. I think even in the reticence for young people to get married, you see a kind of fight or flight. It's uncertain if there's an order, if there's a structure that will support your marriage, right? And so a radical thing that young people can do is get married, because it's radical hope that a marriage itself is an order, which is good. But when the order is corruptive, of the soul or the good of the family, you're terrified. You're maybe you won't articulate it as terror, but there's something terrifying about living in an order which is corrupt. Somebody asked me earlier, what are students like? In fact, it was you. And the first word that came to my mind was timid. Why are they timid? Why are my students so timid? Some of them are not timid. Some of them are bold because they're fired up by woke religion. Woke religion's emboldening because woke religion's got power with it. It's got teeth. It's got the teeth of the administrative state behind it. But many people, I think, are timid because they feel the structures aren't holding. And when that happens, all you have is your belly. You're just trying to kind of get by with whatever brings you pleasure. And this is a very ancient problem. This is precisely the problem that Socrates gives us with commending us to a life of virtue. You recall, of course, the concern with in the post-Socratic period was that students of Socrates either went with Plato, that virtue was in the ascent of the intellect, so the one, or that virtue was simply pleasure. What's virtuous? What's the virtuous life? The life of pleasure. And which way, modern man? Which way should we go? And I think people faced with the terror of disorder are often just picking the lowest appetites as the kind of realm in which they're going to exist and move and fight for, rather than something higher. And I think conservatives have to address that. They have to address that there's material problems that every human being is facing in America, and people are trying to meet those material needs with drugs, with the opioid crisis, with porn, with trying to form communities. It's shocking to see young people who in groups will all of a sudden want to identify as transgendered. Why is that? A sort of desire for sympathy, a desire for community, right? Yes, I will cut off my genitals so that I can belong to this community. These are sort of symptoms of a diseased society, a society that has a structural ailment, and that conservatives have to say, the solution to the ailments is not liberalism. We have to say this is a failed project which has brought us to this feverish city, and we need to, in a sense, reach to deeper religious, spiritual, substantive resources for a cure. Now, this is what Plato lacked. Plato lacks the real spiritual resources to heal a feverish city. And as Patrick Deneen discussed today, that's why Plato's Republic ends with no solution to the feverish city. But I think St. Augustine's solution to the feverish city is true religion, is the church.
On your point about timidity and weakness, because it's something I've also kind of observed, and I'm having a boy, and one of the things that has not haunted me, I think this is something that can be effectively countered with really good parenting and a strong father figure, but I think we live in a very anti-male society, and all of the virtues of masculinity are, the left is very hell-bent on eradicating them from our culture, and they're doing so to a scarily effective degree. And there is this, since you're writing a book on St. Augustine, I also want to get your thoughts on the fringe crypto-pagan line of thought that Christianity is at fault for the decline of the West because of this idea that it has proliferated this weakness and has emasculated society. And obviously, like the fringe crypto-pagan, I'm not going to name the progenitor of this movement.
I know what you mean, yeah.
Yeah. Well, I can't help but be reminded of St. Augustine's City of God when I hear these arguments. So what can we learn from Augustine's City of God in such a conversation?
Yeah, I mean, it's the critics of Christianity, from Celsus to Nietzsche, is a course one could teach. And it's a common line. And, you can get certain pagan right-wing nationalists who spout the same kinds of lies. I mean, what's extraordinary to me is actually the way in which one could make that claim against the image of the Father's love for the Son. Christianity is the revelation of the Father's love for the Son and the Holy Spirit sharing that love with us. And that love is not weakness, but the cause of order itself. And so really what Christianity does is it raises the Father up. It raises the man up from a creature of appetite who just wants sexual pleasure and then to be dispensed with his obligations to a woman and a child, to being raised up to something higher, something more noble. And so, in a sense, Christianity is itself the ennobling principle of the man. Even as much as it ennobles the woman through the vision of Mary, it really makes the man much more responsible, much more virtuous, and more noble. And so it's kind of shocking that one of the pagan critiques could be that somehow Christianity is less manly for that. In fact, it actually raises the man up to something better than a bro.
Chad, I'm curious, one criticism of post-liberals generally, which I actually don't think is a legitimate one, but is that, what does all this mean practically? Like, what does your policy agenda look like? And I know Gladden has done good work on pro-family policy. I know Patrick has been talking for a while about even labor-related policy issues. So I'm curious, what is your, if you were an advisor to the future president, what are the top priorities that you would advise?
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm probably the least policy friendly person as a theologian, but yeah, I mean, I think what I'm probably most associated with is advocating for the use of executive power and legislative power in defense of the unborn. And so that would be my number one priority, is using the president's constitutional authority to interpret the 14th Amendment to protect unborn. And that will be a high priority for me in the next Republican regime in the White House, is to use the full extent of the administrative power of the executive branch to ensure a federal protection of the unborn. And I think my friend Josh Craddock and I have worked on this This is also possible at the state level, at the state executive power and state legislative power, where conservatives have legislative power. As you say, Gladden's family policy, that's the one we want. That's the one we need, in which we commit to 5%, 6% of GDP goes towards incentivizing family growth, family formation and family growth. We had Jonathan Riley speak, about how bad government is for welfare, making Black families actually poor by state welfare. But I think there's a whole host of uses of government action that are good for families. And one of them is incentivizing what is already natural to the human person. It's already natural that men and women should marry. So how do you incentivize that? Not just with cash, but through structural tax incentives, things like our friends in Hungary do. If you have 3 children, you no longer pay taxes. Like, those are incentives, right? That really don't cost the government anything in terms of real expenditure, but actually incentivize something which is productive within the family. And where you incentivize production in the family, you actually expand the good of the nation.
Yeah.
And so
you would say there's a difference then, obviously, between government as a tool for liberalization, releasing the individual from the chains, quote unquote, of family, local community, versus government helping someone to pursue natural ends.
Exactly. Finding those ways in which the government makes it easier to do the thing that you're already ordered to.
Yeah.
So on you previously mentioned, I believe I actually saw Josh Craddock having written about prenatal personhood as being codified in the 14th Amendment for post-liberal order. And I was really happy to see that because I think he's been a really powerful voice in the, crusade against abortion, especially after...
By the way, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but people don't know this about Josh, that Josh has been arguing this since the age of 16 as a homeschooler.
Yeah, we had him on the podcast actually a few weeks ago.
Oh, good, yeah. Mm-hmm. And so he's been arguing this longer than anybody else.
Yeah, no, I think his case is extremely strong. And obviously it was a triumphant day when the Dobbs decision was released. And obviously I think it's half of the U.S. states, if not more, have now enforced these abortion restrictions, which is obviously a huge victory for pro-lifers. So I'm curious, obviously this is this is something that's being enforced legally, and we have to now kind of reform the culture to a certain degree to make sure that the pro-life cause does proliferate, and that we're successful in saving as many children as possible and making it possible for women who do have unplanned pregnancies to not even consider abortion in the first place. How do we remedy the horrors of the last several decades of Roe through culture? Is there a policy proposition that you would suggest to do that, or is this something that needs work in the culture itself?
Help me understand. Are you saying post-Roe or post-abolition?
Sorry. So after, current day, contemporary day, we now have the Dobbs decision. 26 or so states have said there's, you can't, or to some gestational age, you can no longer seek out an abortion. Obviously, a victory for pro-lifers. But going forward, I guess, what in a post-liberal lens, what's the next step for making sure that abortion is perhaps, federally illegal? Or
I think that's the key is that the road to abolition is urgent. And I mean, you wouldn't have thought after a Stephen Douglas speech that you could end slavery incrementally. Your response to that would be, no, we have to end slavery now because this is a matter of justice. And I think it was disappointing to see certain conservatives, and I won't mention them, who thought that the Dobbs decision was a triumph for democracy, as if that's what we were trying to save, right? Democracy is not the thing that we're interested in saving here. We're interested in saving the unborn. And so Dobbs is it's a partial good and that it removes a horrific law from our books, in no way is it bringing justice to bear on the life of the unborn. So, I mean, I think our fight has become, we're just at the beginning of a fight for abolition. And in some ways, the fight for abolition is now much more feasible because of Dobbs. We can now really fight for abolition. But anyone who thinks that somehow we can leave it to the states, I don't think you can take seriously as a conservative. Conservative should conserve human life. And I think it should be the highest priority of the conservative to bring a federal end to abortion. And as you say, have policies in place. And indeed, we do have many policies in place which are designed to aid. But we need a lot more policies in place. I think family policy has to kind of be twinned with abortion abolition. You need a very strong family policy. You need the resources of the federal and state governments aiding families, aiding family formation, aiding the good of marriage. I don't think it's a secret that people like me want to reverse Obergefell, that Obergefell codified in law something which is contrary to the good of the family. It's relativizing. And the cultural work that you rightly point to, I think is not either or. It's not like we have these debates about politics being downstream of culture. It's just too simple. We have to work at the political level to use coercive force to change laws, and we have to work at the cultural level to persuade people that that marriage simply isn't what Obergefell says it is, and that for the good of the family, we have to protect every human life in the womb, and we have to say that marriage is between a man and a woman, and these are things which have to be fought for at the level of law and at the level of culture. I think people underestimate the power of law to shape culture. I know a lot of my colleagues think that people will just disregard law because the culture's not there, but that's not my experience. I mean, Obergefell is great proof. As soon as you change the law, human beings are made to conform to laws, and they're even made, sadly, to conform to unjust laws because we're made this way. We're made to follow authorities. Now, you can be like the guy in Monty Python who says, "I'm not," but you sort of prove the rule the moment you say, "I'm not." And human beings will follow laws, and cultures will follow laws. And so I think it's incumbent upon conservatives to say, okay, well, how do we wield power justly in order to change the laws in accord with what is actually good?
Chad, one last question real quick, and then we have to run. This is not an easy question to answer, but you're writing a book on Augustine, maybe 2 books on Augustine. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the relationship between justice in the soul and justice in the city, and both reflecting on Augustine and Plato.
Yeah, no, just, not, since I'm writing 2 books on it, doesn't seem like a good 2-minute kind of question, but briefly, the Platonic problem, which Professor Janine spoke about this morning at the ISI conference, is really good backdrop that in Plato's Republic, he describes the contrast between the feverish city and the healthy city, and that the city is, in a sense, produced by the soul. It's the production of the souls who found a city and who lead a city, govern a city, but that the structures of the city will reflect any corruption in the soul. And so you, in a sense, need purified souls in order to have a purified city. The knock-on consequences, once you have a sort of feverish city, an ill city, a city which is dragged low by its appetites, you have a city which is also corruptive of new souls. So we not only want to save the unborn physically, but we also want to save souls so that we don't build cities which are corruptive of our youth. And if we think about the structure of our city as essential to the health of our souls, we'll think differently about politics. What we have tended to do as liberal conservatives is to think that somehow the soul is prior to the city, but that's this false set of alternatives. What we really need to understand is that at the root of the soul is this social and political nature. We're made to build a city, and that our cities in turn form us. And so we have to take a keen interest in forming structures that are good for human souls.
I think that's the perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us today, Chad. If people want to read more from you or follow your work, where can they find you?
We're all of our works at the Post-Liberal Order Substack, easily found on Google.
Great. Thanks so much for being with us, Chad.
Thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select modern age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.